Why do some people become more dangerous than the disaster itself? In every collapse scenario, attention tends to fixate on shortages, infrastructure failure, and environmental threats. Those are visible risks, measurable risks. What is less visible and far more lethal is human behavior under prolonged stress. History shows that most casualties after systems fail do not come from the initial event. They come from contact with other survivors whose internal systems have already collapsed. When order dissolves, survival stops being about gear or preparation and becomes a test of psychology. Stress rewires decision-making. Fear compresses moral distance. Identity fractures. In that environment, certain behavioral types emerge reliably, regardless of culture or era. They are not villains, they are patterns, and proximity to them accelerates danger faster than hunger, exposure, or disease. The first mistake people make is assuming threat comes from intent. In reality, threat comes from instability. A person does not need to be violent to become lethal. They only need to be unpredictable, desperate, or convinced of a narrative that justifies harm as necessity. In collapse, belief systems move faster than facts, and fear rewards certainty, not accuracy. Another mistake is assuming these risks announce themselves. They do not. Many of the most dangerous survivors appear functional, cooperative, even helpful, at least initially. The danger emerges over time when pressure accumulates and trade-offs become unavoidable. That is when decision thresholds are crossed quietly, without warning, and often without remorse. Survival psychology research shows that under sustained threat, the brain prioritizes short-term certainty over long-term outcomes. This produces behaviors that feel rational to the individual, but are catastrophic to those nearby. Hoarding becomes justification for exclusion. Paranoia reframes neutrality as hostility. Moral shortcuts become permanent rules. None of this requires malice. It only requires stress without correction. When social systems normally buffer these tendencies, law, reputation, and consequence slow the slide. When those systems fail, personality traits that were once manageable become amplified. Impulsivity turns into recklessness, rigidity turns into dogma, charisma turns into control. These shifts are not random, they follow identifiable trajectories. What makes these survivor types especially dangerous is that they often believe they are doing the right thing. They see themselves as realists, protectors, or leaders. In their internal logic, harm becomes preventative, preemption becomes virtue, and once that framing locks in, negotiation stops being meaningful. This is why understanding survivor archetypes matters more than memorizing tactics. You do not need to predict disasters to survive collapse. You need to recognize behavioral signals before proximity turns into exposure. The greatest risk is not the person who looks dangerous, it is the person whose internal rules have already changed while still appearing familiar. In the next phase, we will break down the first of these types, not as labels, but as behavioral systems. Because once you can see the system, you can see the outcome forming long before it arrives. The first type is the unstable optimizer. This person constantly recalculates survival as a numbers problem. People become variables, and loyalty lasts only until a better equation appears. Early on, they cooperate, share, and plan. Over time, as resources narrow, their calculations shift. Removing risk becomes more efficient than managing it, and people nearby are quietly reclassified as liabilities. The second type is the moral absolutist. Stress pushes them toward rigid rules, not flexibility. They divide the world into right and wrong, pure and corrupt, deserving and undeserving. Once that framework hardens, nuance disappears. Anyone who violates their code becomes a threat by definition, and punishment feels justified, even necessary, to preserve order. The third type is the dependency catalyst. They appear harmless, overwhelmed, and in need of support. Others compensate for their inability to adapt, carrying extra load, making allowances. Over time, this drains group resilience. When resources tighten, resentment grows and conflict follows. Death comes not from intent, but from exhaustion, delay, and misallocated effort. The fourth type is the fear amplifier. They constantly scan for danger and broadcast it. Every unknown becomes a warning. Every silence becomes suspicion. Their anxiety spreads faster than any disease. Groups exposed to this behavior make preemptive decisions, strike early, exclude reflexively. Violence emerges not from threat, but from imagined inevitability. The fifth type is the authority seeker. Collapse creates a vacuum and they move to fill it. Charismatic, decisive, confident, they promise clarity. Over time, control replaces coordination. Dissent becomes disloyalty. Compliance becomes survival. Once power concentrates, lives become tools for maintaining it, not values to be protected. The sixth type is the resource sentinel. They fixate on stockpiles, territory, and boundaries. Everything becomes about defense. Sharing feels like erosion. Movement feels like invasion. Eventually, neutrality no longer exists. Anyone approaching resources is treated as a future attacker. Conflict is framed as prevention, and prevention escalates without pause. The seventh type is the identity fragmented. Under pressure, their sense of self collapses. Past values no longer anchor behavior. They shift roles rapidly. Ally today, adversary tomorrow. Unpredictability becomes the danger. Others cannot model their decisions, and planning around them becomes impossible. Accidental escalation becomes unavoidable. These 7 types do not emerge because people are evil. They emerge because systems fail faster than human psychology adapts. The disaster removes structure, stress removes restraint, time removes patience. What remains are behavioral shortcuts that feel adaptive in isolation but lethal in proximity. This answers the opening question. Some people become more dangerous than the disaster because disasters end. Psychological collapse does not. Once internal rules change, they persist long after the initial threat passes. Recognizing these patterns early is not about judging others. It is about understanding which systems inside people are breaking and what those breaks make inevitable. When survival depends on proximity, awareness becomes the most valuable resource.